Welcome everyone, it's good to see you. My name is Serena Zelezny and I am the founder of What Am I Drinking? We are a consumer-focused wine school based in the suburbs of Philadelphia. We like to create a very safe space when it comes to wine. Wine can be a very intimidating subject, and we want to make sure that everyone can find their way around the wine industry and around a wine store. So we try to create opportunities to learn about wine that is in a comfortable and non-judgmental environment. So I'm just delighted to be with you here today and talk a little bit about some of the techniques that we talk about in the wine world and kind of demystify some of the terms that we use in the wine industry as well. So let's get started. So first I want to talk about what we tend to talk about in terms of wine is what we call the 5 S's. So the 5 S's is our tasting technique. And by way of the 5 S's, I want to kind of guide you through some of our terms that we use as well to try and demystify some of those terms in the wine industry. But the first thing that I would like to talk about is actually just how do we pour a nice glass of wine? So I want to start with discussing temperature and glassware. So when we pour a glass of wine, granted, assuming you are at home and have some control over this, try and find an opportunity to put your wine either in a chiller or a refrigerator. Wine tends to taste much better if it's actually a little bit cooler than room temperature. That's for whites and reds. So we tend to keep our white wines a little bit cooler than they probably need to be. So we tend to put them in the refrigerator for a long period of time, and they're certainly safe there. I would pull them out for a little while before you pour them in order to allow them to come to temperature a little bit. You want to be able to still feel that it's fairly cool to touch, but it definitely does not need to be ice cold. And the reason for that is that the warmer that wine gets, the more we are able to smell that wine, which is a very important part of the wine tasting process, which we'll talk about in a moment. The other thing is with red wines, we tend to pour them a little warmer than they need to be. So white wines tend to be cooler than they need to be, and red wines tend to be a little bit warmer than they probably should be. Most people like to keep them out on the countertop or even above the refrigerator. And certainly I would recommend putting them in the fridge for just a few moments just to cool them off. Remember, feel the outside of that bottle, make sure it's just cool to touch. The reason is that it allows for the retention of some of the compounds, the acidity, and even those aromas. If they get a little bit too warm, that wine can start to feel a little bit one-dimensional. So we want to be able to retain some of those compounds as we start to pour that wine. And as it sits in our glass, it will start to warm up. So we want to be able to give it a little bit of leg room in order to really enjoy it throughout the time that we're drinking it. So the other thing I want to talk about is how to pour the glass. So I like to leave quite a bit of room in my glass. Certainly you can always put more back into the glass as you drink it, but I like to use the opportunity to swirl a little bit. And also if you decide to use a stemless glass, there's a lot of discussion in the wine world about stems versus no stems. In my opinion, it's all about creating something that's comfortable for you. So if you feel like a stemless glass is really the best solution for you, use one. The reason we have stems is to allow for room to swirl. So if you like to use the stem for your swirl, certainly feel comfortable to find a glass that feels comfortable in your hand. I also encourage using the table when we come to swirl. So sometimes that's not so much of an issue so long as you can feel very comfortable doing that motion. But if you feel like you want to use a stemless glass, make sure that you're leaving enough room at the top so that you can grab it with your fingers without feeling like you're going to have a spillage situation. So leave a little bit of room. You don't have to have a special glass. If you want to get extra fancy pants, there's all sorts of glasses sold for this variety or that variety. For most consumers, we just need to find a glass that's comfortable in our hand, maybe is easy to wash, easy to stock away wherever you like to store your glasses. I don't think that there's a real huge difference between stems versus no stems for just average daily wine consumption. So That's our temperature and glassware discussion. Now I want to talk about what we call the 5 S's, which is the technique of tasting. So we always start with C. So now that we've got our glass poured, we can actually put that glass fairly close to the body and then out at an angle. I like to call this my on guard position. So you can look down into this glass at an angle, and hopefully you've got something fairly neutral underneath you. And the idea here is to start to look at the color of the wine. So white or red, you might start to notice that some wines tend to skew a little bit more toward like a creamy green or yellow. Some tend to get a little bit more of a heavy yellow or gold. And then in red wines, you might notice that they can be almost like a translucent red, and some get very, very dense and even a purple color. All of those are little tips about what we are about to consume. So that darkness in color could indicate richness of that wine. So I might assume that if it's a fairly dense color, that might have a lot more richness in the mouth. It may also tell me that there's a thicker skinned grape in that wine. So maybe some more tannin would be present there. In terms of white wine, if it's turning really, really gold, maybe that means there's some oak influence there. So all of those little tips might actually trigger some interest before I even start to sip this wine and tell me a little bit about what I'm about to consume. So that could be very helpful. The other thing is we want to make sure that it's fairly sound. So we want to look at it and make sure that there's nothing really floating around in that wine. So I like to compare this to like a hazy IPA. The wine should be fairly clear. We let it rest in tanks and barrels and all sorts of different vessels for a period of time. And any heavy compounds should filter to the bottom. And by way of that filtration or through other processes, we should be able to have a fairly clear looking wine, even when they're fairly dense, like we talked about earlier. But if you start to notice that there's a bit of a haze, it might trigger a few questions for you. So we do have a fairly uprising natural wine movement that sometimes involves less filtration, and that might mean that there's just a little bit of stuff floating around in that wine. But if it's really a haze, it could indicate there's a little bit of bacteria that may have seeped in at some point. So that might get me to start asking questions. If this is not a natural wine, is something else actually going on here? So otherwise, you should have a fairly clear wine. So that's the first two things that I start to look at when I look at our first S, which is C. So the next S is actually going to be our swirl. I actually always like to set a benchmark smell. So I always stick my nose right in that glass, take a deep sniff, just to kind of see where it is in the spectrum in terms of a really strong smell or a really light smell. A really strong smell might indicate that there's a lot of complexity to that wine. A really light smell might tell me there's still more to come out. But I want to set that benchmark just because everybody is different. Wine tasting is very unique and personal to each individual. So we want to make sure that we're not comparing ourselves to somebody else. I set that benchmark just to see where all my senses are at the moment, and then I'm going to move into my swirl. Now swirl, there is a technique to this. And I know that swirls look extra fancy pants, so maybe you don't want to do this at your next dinner party unless nobody's looking. But it actually is very, very helpful. So we actually tend to just put the wine glass down on the table where it feels safe. And then you can use your elbow and your shoulder and your wrist to create a circle on that glass so that it creates a little vortex in the glass. And really what we're doing here is, and you've probably heard this term breathe, which is one of the words I wanted to talk about today, breathe, or allowing for it to be aerated. And all of that really means is we're starting to agitate some of that wine to allow for some of the aromas to come to the surface. And they are aided by alcohol, actually. So alcohol is a volatile compound, and it evaporates very easily. It won't be all of the alcohol, so you don't have to worry about that. But as that alcohol starts to come to the surface and start to evaporate, it will take with it several hundred aromatic compounds that exist in your glass of wine. It's an awful lot. It's a lot even for our brains to comprehend. So we want to have a fairly clear idea of what it is that those aromas entail. So we're trying to expose ourselves to as many aromas as possible. So although this swirl thing looks extra fancy, we really are aiding our senses and allowing us for really to be able to appreciate the wine and all that it is. So the swirl is the second thing. So breathe is really just, or aeration is really just allowing for that alcohol to start to come to the surface and bring with it those aromas. Those aromas can get trapped under the surface, especially if your wine is fairly rich or dense. So we want to make sure that those are coming to the surface so we can take a good sniff. So our next portion of the swirl is actually allowing us to look at what we call legs, which is another term that I wanted to talk about. Legs, lacing, tiers, even church windows. This is all synonymous for the same thing. And it's basically the little tiering that starts to come down the glass. Mine doesn't have a whole ton of it, but you can start to see it stream down the side of that glass. That's usually an indicator of alcohol content. So the more alcohol we have in that wine, the more apparent those tiers might be, the slower and fatter those might be. And then the other thing that could cause some of that tiering is some sugar content. Most people these days don't like to consume a lot of dessert wines, but certainly if you did, you might notice that that's a density that would start to appear on the side of the glass by way of tiers or lacing. So that's our legs. Smell is our next S. So smell is actually probably the most important thing that I can impart to you today. If you don't do any of these other 5 S's, I would encourage that if you can, always try and take a moment to smell your wine and take a few moments with this. So when we talk about taste, we always refer to wine tasting in terms of flavors and things like that. But actually, our taste buds can only pick up sweet, salty, bitter, umami. It does not actually pick up flavor. When we refer to taste, it is really a combination of smelling through the nose and smelling retronasally, or by way of the mouth, so it sends it back up through the sinuses. So that is what we use to construct this concept of taste or flavor. So allowing for us to smell is really critical here because it's about 85% of our tasting experience. The other is sensations that we're going to pick up in the mouth. So when we smell, we're trying to pick up both the aromas or the bouquet of this wine, but we're also trying to detect what am I to expect when I do put this in my mouth, when I start to taste this wine? Are these aromas that I will now detect when I put this in my mouth as well? The other thing about smell is it helps to indicate whether or not there's something awry with this wine. So we've already looked at it for any haziness or floaters or anything like that, but we also should make sure that the wine smells appropriately. And when I say smells appropriately, your wine should never smell like a basement. It should never smell like wet, moldy cardboard. And there are a lot of opportunities out there when we use a cork. Sometimes those corks can be exposed to bacteria. TCA is a common one, and it can actually impart some real weird odors to our wine. Many people just think that there's something weird about that wine and they consume it anyway, but do know that if your wine should be fairly fruit forward or have lovely fruit aromas, it should not smell like a damp basement. So if your wine smells like a damp basement, it might be an indicator that there's something wrong with that, and you certainly do not have to drink a bottle that smells like that. So that's another thing that we pick up from smell. That's the reason when you go into a restaurant, someone pours a little bit for you, take a smell, and they put the cork down in front of you. You're testing to see if that wine is corked, and that's the term for that. So a wine that is corked might be impacted by a faulty or a cork that has some bacteria present. So always be aware of that. So now we've smelled our wine, we've taken our first few smells, and I like to take a nice amount of time here. Wine does evolve, we've done some swirling, those aromas are coming to the surface. So take a few moments to smell, and then when we get through the smell, our next 2 S's are of course our favorites. The first one is going to be our sip. So once you get to the sip section, Now we're looking for basically a support for some of the smells that we picked up through the nose. Because remember, we're actually sending those smells, those aromas back up through the nose retronasally. So what we want to do is see if any other, what we would call flavors, start to come forward to kind of support what we've smelled before, or maybe add to the complexity of that wine. So let it sit in the mouth for a second. You don't have to guzzle it down immediately. Also, by allowing it to sit in the mouth for a moment, you might notice sensations in the mouth. And this is another important part of the tasting process. The first one I want to talk about is acidity. So acidity is present in most, well, all wines to some extent, but many wines will show some good acidity. And you might notice that right in the jawline. So you'll feel a little bit of tingling or maybe some tension in the jawline. You'll notice that your mouth is starting to water a little bit, and it either is on the side of the mouth or underneath the tongue, just some salivation. And that's just like when we start to eat some kind of a citrus fruit. You might notice that your mouth salivates when you eat those citrus fruits or strawberries, something else with high acidity. And that is definitely true with wine as well. This is what allows for it to be refreshing, but it also allows it to go with food. As we have fats and other creamy characteristics in food, that acidity helps us to kind of cut through that. So having acidity in wine is actually an important part of its balance. So acidity is going to be present, so you'll want to look for that. The other thing is, if we are drinking a red wine, we will have presence of tannin. Sometimes it's high levels and sometimes it's lower levels. Sometimes it's very smooth. Sometimes it's a little bit more grippy or gritty. And tannin is basically a compound that we find in a lot of other foods. If you like to eat dark chocolate, you'll have noticed tannin in your dark chocolate before. If you've ever oversteeped your tea, that kind of grippy sensation that you get from your tea, that is also tannin. Tannin is even present in that kind of stringy part of the banana peel, if you've ever eaten that. So that is all tannin, and tannin exists in the skins and the seeds of the grape. So when we make red wine, we allow for the juice to sit with the skins and the seeds for a period of time. In white wine, we remove them immediately. So we don't actually have any impart of the tannins are not necessarily present in the white wine. So in the red wine, what we're looking for is the presence of tannin. And it may be that it's a fairly intense level or a fairly soft level, but you would notice it by astringency in the mouth. And I don't use the term dry here, although it is a drying sensation, because we use the term dry for something else, which I'll explain in a second. But the astringency in the mouth can make your mouth feel like either in sandpaper or like a velvety quality. Many people come to me and they're like, "What's that feeling?" And that is just tannin. It's that kind of drying sensation or astringent sensation that comes from the skins and the seeds of those grapes. So you'll notice that when you take your first sip of a red wine. The other thing you'll start to notice is body. So the body can be fairly light, even in a red wine. And I like to consider this a similar comparison in terms of milk. So if you drink milk and you are familiar with what non-fat milk feels like, or even water, it's a very light feeling. And then we also have on the other end of the spectrum cream, which is going to feel a little bit richer in the mouth. So you might notice the same thing occur with wine. Some wines feel very fresh, very light. You may even notice that in the glass as you were swirling it around, that it looks very like light-bodied. And then others will be much richer. So that allows us to start to think about what might this go with in terms of food pairing. Certainly you wouldn't want your wine to overpower your food, so you want something that is a little bit comparable there. But looking for that body can be very helpful in starting to detect some of the compounds of this wine and its balance as well. So let's go back to that term dry, because this is the other thing that might come up. And dry refers to, in wine terms, it refers to sugars. So when I say that a wine is dry, it means that the yeast has eaten the sugar to create the alcohol. So by the tongue, it's barely undetectable. So if we have any residual sugar, we can't really detect that by the tongue. We've converted it into our alcohol content. That would mean a wine is fairly dry. A wine that is maybe off dry or semi-dry might mean that we intentionally stopped the fermentation. So we were allowing the yeast to eat the sugar to create alcohol, and then we cooled it off a little bit, which would be one way of doing this. And that yeast would then stop doing its job and kind of go into hibernation. And we could remove that yeast and kind of retain some of that sugar level in order to create a slightly sweet wine. And so that would be an off-dry or a semi-sweet wine. So certainly if you've experimented with some dessert wines or even some sparkling wines that weren't fully dry, you might start to notice some of that sweetness present. So although tannin is a drying compound, I tend to use the term astringent just so not to create some confusion when I use the term dry to refer to not sweet. Now, a wine can still be fairly fruity, meaning that it reminds me a lot of fruits. So remember, when we are smelling and swirling, we're really just triggering memories of other things that we've eaten before. So this is what makes this very personal. So you may not have eaten or experienced some of the same fruits and vegetables or herbs that I may have experienced. So certainly you're triggering the memories that you have, and I'm triggering the memories that I have. But that might be a slightly different way to think about fruit, is that it doesn't necessarily have to be sweet. It's just reminding me of that fruit. So fruitiness can still be present even when the wine is not very sweet. Okay, so we're moving on to our last S, which is our savor. And then I'm going to take some questions. So savor has to do with allowing for the wine to kind of slip down as you swallow, noticing any additional sensations in the mouth. Again, we were looking for that body and balance. And balance has to do with kind of creating this partnership, this harmony between the compounds of the wine. So the acid, the alcohol, the sugar levels, the tannin, and even the water. Wine is mostly made up of water. So remember, this is coming from fruit. So water is an important compound here. So what we're trying to do is create some harmony between those things. If something is especially out of sync, that might kind of stick out to you as something that seems a little bit high or low. Some wines have a little bit lower acidity than you might expect. So sometimes that might feel a little bit out of sorts. Sometimes alcohol, especially when we look at wines made here in the United States, sometimes they're a little bit higher than you would expect, and you can actually start to feel that in your chest. So when we go to the savor section, we're really looking for how does this wine sit with me? Does it linger for a period of time? Do I still kind of feel it in my mouth, or even taste or sense those flavors that we talked about earlier? Any of that acidity, does that stick around for a while? So all of that we're kind of paying attention to. Is it providing us with a fairly good experience? Because what it all comes down to, what wine tasting is all about, is did you like it? So does it come down to something that feels fairly pleasant? Would you want to drink another glass of this? Does it go with your food? So that's really what we're looking for here, is am I creating some balance? Does it feel like something that was a fairly positive experience? So that is our savor situation. The other thing that might come up, and this is another word that I wanted to talk about, is the word terroir. So terroir is kind of a difficult term to understand and get our brains around, but terroir refers to the environment that a grape was grown in. And sometimes when we look at certain grapes, we can pick them up and plant them in multiple places around the world. Some grapes will taste pretty much the same. So Cabernet Sauvignon is a pretty hardy grape that tends to taste fairly similar regardless of where we put it. Pinot Noir, on the other hand, tends to really pick up elements of its environment. So it might be the soil, it could be the climate, it could be the slope of the vineyard, it could be how close it is to water. All of those create this recipe of what that particular grape has now gone through, and then what it might actually ultimately reflect in the final wine. So those might be something, components of its growth might actually come through as you start to assess that wine. And especially as you start to drink wines from multiple regions. If you pick up a Pinot Noir from France or a Pinot Noir from Oregon, you might start to notice that there are similarities, but there's also some differences too. And that could have something to do with that. You would especially notice that once you get through your smell and your savor, you would really start to take a sense for, is this a wine that seems fairly different from something else I've had? All right, so let's get to some questions because I want to make sure we are using our time as best as possible. How long does wine last? That's a really great question. And this is from our Facebook Live, and thanks for all of you who are chiming in from there. So I want to talk about a little bit, wine lasts both in the bottle and then once we open the bottle. There's two different rules of thumb here. So depending on the quality of the wine, if you have not opened that bottle, if you put it in a fairly safe space. So for me, a safe space might be in either in a wine rack that's fairly guarded from light. One of the big challenges for wine, and we tend to love these beautiful glass bottles that we can look right through, but wine is easily deteriorated by sunshine. So you want to make sure if you've got one of these open wine racks that it's not in full view of a window or in an area that gets fairly hot. So if you put it in a place like a dark area, even a closet, a wine fridge, then it can actually hold for some time. It depends on the variety and the quality of that wine. Typically, red wines can save a little longer than white wines, but there are a lot of components that can go into that. But most wines, I would say today, about 95% are intended to consume within the first year. So once you buy them, no need to really hold on to a lot of them, and many wines can actually get held a little longer than they need to be. Now, once I open a bottle of wine, the rule of thumb is 3 to 5 days. So I would suggest putting it in the refrigerator. It slows down the deterioration process. You can put a little capsule on the top, a little stopper. That might help a little bit. There's only a few ways to really slow down that process, and that involves certain types of gas or other special closures. I would say for the most part, just plan on drinking that wine within the 3 to 5 day period. You'll start to notice it start to deteriorate even in the second day, but some wines will actually taste better the second day. So 3 to 5 days for the most part. Okay. Great question here. So is there a way to know if a wine will be sweet? Yes. So the best way to do this is actually to look at the alcohol content. So you'll want to turn the bottle around and look for that ABV. So the process of fermentation, and this is the case most of the time. Now we do have some wines that are intended as dessert wines, and there's a slightly other process for that, but for the most part, if you're not sure and it doesn't indicate on there semi-sweet or dessert wine or anything like that, it's not a variety that you're sure. So let's say it's a Riesling, right? So there's dry Rieslings that are phenomenal, high acidity, very fresh. And then there's kind of those off-dry or semi-sweet Rieslings. The best way to determine if it's going to be the off-dry kind is to look at that alcohol content. Most wines will fall somewhere between 12 and 14 or 14.5% alcohol. As you start to notice a wine, especially like a Riesling, start to inch down toward like 11.5 or 11%, you're gonna have just a little bit of sweetness present there. And then once you get down to like 9%, you're talking fairly sweet. So 7 to 9% is what we would call a fairly sweet wine. So look at that alcohol content. That could give you some clues as to how sweet that wine is. All right, what else have we got here? Okay, a friend has migraines triggered by some wines. Would you know what kind of wine would be good for her to try or types she should avoid? Okay, so migraines are tricky, and I am not a doctor, so certainly this should be a discussion she should have with her doctor. But most migraines, especially if she knows that they are red wine migraines, they could be triggered by a couple of things. So tannin, as we mentioned, are fairly drying. So it can be really rough if you do have a tendency toward migraines because it can cause some some constrictions in your blood vessels. So as it dries out your system, you can start to get a little dehydrated and not even notice it. So tannin could be a problem here. The other thing is that many red wines have some exposure to histamines, which can cause some sinus trouble, some headaches. So some people report having red wine headaches, and that's probably the two things that might be the culprits there. So I would suggest that she try, if she likes red wine and the red wine has been the problem, maybe try something that is a lighter tannin style. So Pinot Noir would be a really great example. And she might want to look at some that are from areas that tend to be a little bit cooler in terms of climate. So maybe Santa Barbara, California, Oregon, even France would give her some Pinot Noirs that would be a little lighter in color. This one is actually a Pinot Noir. You can kind of see through it. So that's what I would look for in a wine, just to test to see what that does for her. It tends to be that the real dense, thick, rich wines might be more likely to trigger some of those problems. All right, which wine is good for beginners? Does wine cause weight gain? Okay. So wine could cause weight gain. I would say there's a few things to look at here. Look for a wine that is fairly dry in order to reduce your exposure to added sugars. And there's another kind of rule of thumb here that I like to follow. Sometimes that means that you're going to spend just a little bit more. Now, I'm not talking a ton more. You don't have to break the bank for a bottle of wine. I would say, maybe plan on spending about $12. And that starts to put us into a fairly good bottle of wine from a region that is fairly reputable, and maybe even from a vineyard that uses fairly good practices. As we spend less and less, it leaves the door open for more shortcuts. So certainly there's an opportunity for some additional sugar to be present there, which could cause some weight gain. Wine that's good for beginners. So it really depends on your style. I find that white wines tend to be a little bit more approachable for some people. So I would maybe start with some of the basic varieties and just see what tends to be the most appealing to you. Right now, a rosé might be a very good in-between grape to kind of play with and see what is attractive. And then pay attention to those compounds we talked about earlier. If you don't love lots of acidity, that stuff that makes your mouth feel very zesty and fresh, if that's not for you, you might want to look at a grape variety that's a little bit richer, maybe a Chardonnay that's got a little bit of oak influence on it, and see if that's a little bit more your style. If you really want something that's much richer, you can start to play with some red wines. And as I said, Pinot Noir would be a great place to start. It's not overly intense in terms of a tannin, but it has some really good flavors as well. And it's a very good food friendly wine as well. All right. Allergic reactions, but not always. Whether or not it happens almost seems to be random. I've heard about sulfites or tannins being the cause of this. Yes. Okay, so let's talk sulfites a little bit. Sulfites are one of the big myths in the wine world. Sulfites exist in a lot of foods, So just to put this in perspective, in wine, we're usually looking at about 175 to 350 parts per million of sulfites. And sulfites are basically just a compound that combines oxygen and sulfur. It is naturally occurring during the fermentation process. And we do sometimes have a little bit present during the bottling process or the winemaking process, just to make sure that wine doesn't start to deteriorate. As I said, it's very susceptible to sunshine. And just like any other fruit we might cut in half and put on our counter, like an apple, and it starts to kind of turn brown within a few minutes, we don't want that to happen to our wine after we spent so much time trying to create it. So sulfites are a natural compound that even the grapes build up on their own to try and prevent that deterioration. So over time, as we've gotten better and better at winemaking, we don't use a whole ton of that, so it's not something to be super alarmed about. to put in comparison, so we've got max about 350 parts per million in a bottle of wine. For example, dried fruit is like 1,000. So there are a lot of different foods, teas, baked goods, boxes of noodles, soup packets, all have fairly significant amounts of sulfites. So when it comes to wine, I think sometimes it's been created as a little bit of a scare tactic. And the story goes that the label on the back of the bottle, because it really only exists here in the US, is left over from Prohibition and people trying to discourage people from drinking wine. So other countries don't necessarily have that label, although the sulfites are still present there as well. But it isn't necessarily a huge amount of sulfites. People who do have sulfite allergy usually know that ahead of time. Many of them have a history with asthma, and they might notice a little tightness in the chest. And that's usually with white wines more than red wines, because those white wines are a little more susceptible to that deterioration. So I would say sulfites are probably not the problem. Tannin could be. So for someone who's having allergic reactions, I'm not sure if it's headaches or hives or a rash, but histamines and tannins are the ones that they're still continuing to test to see those relationships. Histamines, are present on the outside of the skin or of the grape and could certainly trigger something like that. Sometimes sulfites can cause a little bit of a rash, but usually it's in conjunction with the kind of tightness in the chest or the breathing trouble. So if she's having trouble with tannins or histamines, I would stick with white wines and see if that removes the problem. And also see if tea is causing the same problem, because tea would cause the same problem. But if she can stick to white wines, that might remove the issue. So certainly that would be something to kind of play with there as well. All right, let's see here. All right, can wine spoil? This is one other question. Can wine spoil? So yes, it can spoil. It can spoil before it's been opened. It can also spoil after it's been opened. So if you let a wine sit for a long period of time, I have a great story of going back for Thanksgiving to see my family. I'm from California, and we opened something really nice that didn't get finished, and my grandmother put it in the refrigerator and brought it back out at Christmas, a month and a half later, and she said, here you go, here's this great wine we opened. That wine is definitely now vinegar. So it can spoil. Also wines that you don't open or that are put in environments that aren't necessarily conducive to saving a bottle of wine, like in a warm environment or right in the sunshine, they can start to deteriorate much faster as well. So yes, they can spoil. And can you buy grapes and make your own wine? Sure, it is definitely possible. There are all sorts of kits available for you if you would like to try that. They don't always turn out super, but it's certainly a fun experiment to be sure. All right, thank you. It looks like we've got through all the questions. It's been such a delight to be with all of you, and I thank you all for your time today. And I thank you also to Girls Night In Online for hosting these events. They are spectacular. So we hope to see you at another one very, very soon.